On the 22nd of March, 1945, along the banks of the Rhine River, a pivotal moment in the Second World War was unfolding. For many months, Allied military leaders had been meticulously devising strategies to overcome the formidable defenses established by the Nazi regime, which had been branded as Hitler's final bastion. Extensive preparations were undertaken, involving the mobilization of vast armies, the stockpiling of immense quantities of ordnance, and the drafting of intricate battle protocols. Field Marshal Montgomery, a prominent British commander, was orchestrating what was intended to be the most significant riverine assault since the D-Day landings, with its scheduled commencement on the 24th of March. However, General George S. Patton, Jr., an American officer known for his audacious tactics, executed a maneuver that defied all expectations. He successfully led his forces across the Rhine in a single night, utilizing rudimentary canvas boats and an unwavering spirit of daring. When Prime Minister Winston Churchill received news of this remarkable feat, his reaction surprised and impressed everyone present. The sentiments he expressed at that precise juncture would illuminate profound truths about effective leadership, the nature of competition, and the underlying factors that truly determine victory in warfare. This is the narrative of that extraordinary event. Before we delve into the details, we encourage you to honor our commitment by subscribing to our channel. These in-depth explorations of history's most compelling episodes necessitate substantial research, and your subscription is instrumental in enabling us to continue producing such content. We also invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below, highlighting what you find most astonishing about this particular historical account. By the early months of 1945, the German Reich was in a state of rapid disintegration. However, one significant impediment remained: the Rhine River. Adolf Hitler had proclaimed it Germany's ultimate defensive moat, issuing stern orders for the destruction of every bridge spanning its waters. The river itself posed a formidable threat. In some sections, it stretched over 1,000 feet in width. Its waters were frigid, and the currents were so powerful they could easily capsize smaller vessels. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower had officially sanctioned Montgomery's ambitious plan, codenamed Operation Plunder. Montgomery dedicated several weeks to exhaustive preparations, amassing 25 divisions and an array of equipment so substantial it would have filled a dozen freight trains. He even extended an invitation to Winston Churchill, anticipating that this operation would be hailed as the war's defining triumph. The preparations were so exceedingly thorough that American officers humorously remarked that Montgomery would likely employ more ceremony in crossing the Rhine than the Germans themselves used in defending it. Enormous depots filled with supplies extended for miles, and artillery pieces were strategically positioned with exacting mathematical precision. Military engineers diligently rehearsed bridge construction techniques on rivers in Belgium that bore a resemblance to the Rhine. Every conceivable detail was meticulously planned, and every potential adverse scenario was anticipated. 200 meters to the south, George Patton harbored a distinctly different strategic outlook. Patton's Third Army had been advancing across France and Germany at an unprecedented and almost unbelievable pace. His operational philosophy was straightforward: advance swiftly, strike ferociously, and never afford the enemy the opportunity to regroup or strategize. While other commanders were preoccupied with the complexities of supply lines and troop formations, Patton's primary concern was maintaining momentum. He firmly believed that hesitation had claimed more lives on the battlefield than enemy fire. On the 21st of March, as his forces neared the Rhine close to the town of Oppenheim, His intelligence officer presented him with reconnaissance reports. The officer informed him, "General, the western bank appears to be lightly defended. There are perhaps 200 German infantry soldiers, with no armored units. Their focus is entirely on Montgomery's operations to the north." Patton studied the map in contemplative silence. His staff officers observed him, recognizing the subtle signs of intense calculation. The general was not merely assessing logistical data, he was evaluating an unfolding opportunity. "Summon Eddie to my presence," he commanded. It was 10:47 p.m. when Major General Manton S. Eddy received Patton's urgent summons. "Manton," Patton stated decisively, "you are crossing tonight. There will be no delays. Utilize whatever watercraft are available. I require a full regiment to be established on the eastern bank by dawn." Eddy grasped the directive immediately. "We possess assault boats, sir," he responded. "The 5th Infantry Division is prepared." "Then commence movement at once," Patton snapped. "And Eddy," he added, lowering his voice, "maintain absolute silence regarding this operation to headquarters. We will execute the crossing first and provide explanations later." This was characteristic of Patton's operational style, pushing the boundaries of insubordination, driven by an almost instinctual compulsion to outmaneuver Montgomery. His chief of staff documented in his diary that night, "The general paced like a caged tiger." He repeatedly voiced his conviction, "Montgomery covets the glory. Well, we shall see about that." The professional rivalry between Patton and Montgomery had been a simmering undercurrent throughout the war, evident in campaigns from Sicily to Normandy and during the rapid advance across France. At virtually every significant juncture, the two generals found themselves in competition. Montgomery embodied the traditions of British military strategy, methodical, cautious, and overwhelming in its application of force. Patton, conversely, exemplified American military aggression, swift, bold, and highly intuitive. Their contrasting styles inevitably led to friction, further amplified by their considerable egos. The 5th Infantry Division began its movement towards Oppenheim at midnight. These soldiers were seasoned combat veterans who had participated in fierce fighting since the Normandy landings, and they sensed that something highly unusual was occurring. Sergeant Warren M. later recounted, "We received word around 1 a.m. Light march, assault boats, move silently. No one articulated it openly, but we understood we were heading for the Rhine." The advance took place under conditions of near-total darkness. Patton had ordered minimal use of vehicular traffic to prevent alerting German reconnaissance patrols. The infantrymen carried their assault boats on foot, unwieldy craft weighing approximately 450 pounds, constructed from canvas and plywood, requiring 12 men to transport. The physical burden was immense. Soldiers stumbled over the uneven terrain, muttering curses under their breath. Officers conveyed instructions in hushed tones. The night air was so cold that visible vapor escaped from their breaths. Yet the soldiers were perspiring from the strenuous exertion. At intervals of a few hundred yards, they would rotate the carriers, allowing fresh troops to assume the load while others recuperated. At precisely 10:30 p.m. on March 22nd, the initial wave of boats was launched into the water. The Rhine at Oppenheim was approximately 1,000 feet wide, with a current flowing at nearly 4 knots. The night was moonless, providing essential concealment, but rendering navigation a hazardous undertaking. Private First Class Donald Jones was positioned in the third boat. "We were packed in tightly," he recalled. 12 of us, plus the engineer steering. The water was absolutely freezing. Every wave sent spray over the sides. I remember thinking, if the Germans open fire now, we're finished. Yet, they continued to paddle. For 11 minutes, which felt like an eternity, they propelled themselves forward. Every splash of water sounded deafeningly loud, and every creak of the boat seemed amplified enough to alert the entire German army. The soldiers paddled in unison, their movements dictated by a mechanical rhythm born of training and an underlying sense of apprehension. Not a word was spoken. Their eyes strained towards the opposite shore, scanning for the faint glow of muzzle flashes, listening intently for the first sharp crack of rifle fire. Miraculously, the initial boats landed without encountering any enemy resistance. The German defenders, significantly outnumbered and demoralized, had not anticipated an assault at this specific location. Their attention remained entirely focused on Montgomery's overtly conspicuous preparations to the north. By 11:15 p.m., 2 companies had successfully secured a foothold on the eastern bank. Lieutenant Donald Critchfield remembered, "We reached the beach, which was really just a muddy embankment, and fanned out. Still no contact. Then we heard German voices approximately 200 yards inland. They were simply conversing, smoking. They had no inkling of our presence." The American troops advanced silently, establishing defensive positions with their weapons at the ready, fingers poised on their triggers. But their orders were explicit. Do not engage unless fired upon. The objective was to allow more troops to cross, consolidating their strength before revealing the full scope of the assault. By midnight, 8 companies had successfully made the crossing. Nearly 1,200 American soldiers were actively digging in on the eastern bank. When the Germans finally recognized the magnitude of the infiltration, their response was disjointed and largely ineffective. It was far too late. Back at 3rd Army headquarters, Patton monitored the radio transmissions with barely contained excitement. His aide observed that the general was chain-smoking, an indication of considerable stress, but he was also smiling. When the report arrived confirming the successful crossing of the initial battalions with minimal casualties, Patton actually laughed aloud. He then declared, "Montry is still filling sandbags, and we are already in Germany's bedroom." By dawn on the 23rd of March, Patton had successfully transported 4,000 troops across the Rhine. Engineers were actively ferrying tanks using makeshift rafts. The bridgehead was expanding with remarkable speed. German counterattacks, when they materialized, were weak and poorly organized. At 7:30 a.m., Patton finally contacted Supreme Headquarters. The ensuing conversation with General Omar Bradley would become legendary. Patton's voice, transmitted over the radio, was crisp and exultant. "Brad, for heaven's sake, inform the world that we have crossed. I want everyone to know that the 3rd Army arrived before Monty commences." Bradley responded with confusion. "Crossed what, George?" "The Rhine, Brad," Patton replied. "I discreetly moved a division over last night, but let's keep it confidential until we assess the situation's progress." Bradley later wrote, "I was utterly astonished. George had crossed the Rhine with less preparation than we had used to cross the Seine." It was at that moment that Bradley realized this endeavor was as much about outdoing Montgomery as it was about defeating the Germans. The sheer audacity of the act was breathtaking. While Montgomery meticulously assembled the largest river crossing operation since D-Day, Patton had simply paddled across in canvas boats under the cloak of darkness. There was no massive artillery preparation, no weeks of intricate planning, merely the recognition and immediate exploitation of a fleeting opportunity. The news spread rapidly. By mid-morning, General Eisenhower was aware of the situation. His public reaction was one of measured support, though privately he was reportedly annoyed by Patton's flamboyant, almost reckless, theatrics. Eisenhower highly valued cooperation and coordination, whereas Patton prioritized tangible results and personal acclaim. Their professional relationship was perpetually strained by this fundamental divergence in their approaches. However, the most significant reactions came from Winston Churchill and Field Marshal Montgomery. Field Marshal Montgomery learned of Patton's crossing at 11:20 a.m. on March 23rd, a mere 13 hours before his own Operation Plunder was slated to commence. His response, as recorded by witnesses, was delivered with a chillingly cold tone. "I perceive Patton has breached the Rhine. How utterly American. Let us proceed with our planned operations. We shall unequivocally demonstrate the distinction between a mere river crossing and a genuinely professional military endeavor." Montgomery's pride was clearly wounded, yet his professionalism remained uncompromised. Operation Plunder would proceed exactly according to the original schedule, with no adjustments made and no acknowledgement of the altered circumstances. British military discipline dictated a steadfast adherence to the plan. Montgomery's operation commenced at midnight with a 4-hour artillery bombardment involving 3,500 guns. The sheer volume of fire created an apocalyptic cacophony, audible for miles. Shells screamed through the air in continuous, relentless waves. The night sky was illuminated by an eerie orange glow emanating from the countless muzzle flashes. The operation was methodical, overwhelming, and ultimately successful. However, it conspicuously lacked the elements of surprise and speed that Patton had so brilliantly achieved. Winston Churchill was present with Montgomery, having arrived to personally witness what was intended to be Britain's crowning military achievement. Upon receiving the news of Patton's audacious Rhine crossing, Churchill was partaking in breakfast within Montgomery's command caravan. This moment was personally observed by Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff. According to Brooke's private diary, Churchill was in the process of spreading marmalade on a piece of toast when an aide handed Montgomery a message. Montgomery read the dispatch, his expression hardening perceptibly, and then passed it to Churchill without comment. Churchill read the terse note. Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim at 22:30 hours on 22nd March. Bridgeheads secured with minimal casualties. Churchill slowly set down his toast. For a prolonged moment, he remained silent. Every individual within that caravan understood the profound implications of this news for Montgomery's anticipated moment of glory. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to be almost severed. The assembled officers averted their gazes, suddenly finding their breakfast plates intensely fascinating. Then, Churchill finally spoke. "Brilliant," he declared, his voice initially soft, then rising in volume. "Absolutely brilliant. That magnificent American cowboy has accomplished it once again." Montgomery visibly stiffened. "Prime Minister," he began, his tone strained, "that operation was entirely unauthorized and, from a tactical perspective, completely unnecessary." Churchill interjected with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Bernard," he said firmly, "I am fully aware of our current situation. We are executing the most meticulously planned operation of the entire war. We have guaranteed success. However, what Patton has achieved, crossing the Rhine with assault boats and sheer audacity, that is the kind of warfare that brings wars to a swift conclusion." He paused for a moment, then added with a faint smile, "And it rather makes our extensive preparations appear rather elaborate, wouldn't you agree?" The comment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Churchill's private secretary later recorded that Montgomery appeared as though he had just received a physical blow. The unspoken reprimand was unmistakably clear. Perhaps it was implied. Britain had become overly cautious, excessively methodical, and consequently, too slow. But Churchill was not yet finished. He turned to Brooke. The Americans have bestowed upon us a considerable advantage. Patton's crossing will undoubtedly divert vital German reserves to the south. Hitler will undoubtedly fall into a state of panic when he learns that the Rhine has been breached at two separate points. This situation could not have evolved more favorably for us. This was Churchill at his most insightful and strategic, adeptly transforming a potentially embarrassing development into a significant tactical advantage. In mere seconds, he had completely reframed the entire scenario. What could have been perceived as reckless American impetuosity overshadowing meticulous British planning was artfully reinterpreted as effective Allied coordination, compelling Germany to divide its defensive forces. However, in private communications addressed to London, Churchill expressed his sentiments with greater candor. In a dispatch sent on the 24th of March, he wrote, "Patton has boldly crossed the Rhine with his characteristic American flair. While Montgomery's meticulously planned operation will undoubtedly yield more significant strategic consequences, we must nonetheless acknowledge that speed and audacity continue to hold a vital place in warfare. The Americans have effectively reminded us that wars are won not solely through meticulous planning, but also through the unwavering will to embrace calculated risks." Churchill's public pronouncements were even more magnanimous. He stated, "The successful crossing of the Rhine by both American and British forces signifies the beginning of the war's end. General Patton's swift and decisive assault, alongside Field Marshal Montgomery's powerful and well-executed operation, unequivocally demonstrate the overwhelming military might of the Allied powers." But what specific words did Churchill privately impart to Patton himself? Churchill and Patton convened on March 26th, when the Prime Minister visited the Third Army's established bridgehead. Patton, never one to shy away from taking credit, arranged for Churchill to walk across a newly constructed pontoon bridge. Army photographers were present to capture this historic moment. Churchill, clad in his overcoat and holding a cigar, stood alongside Patton, who was resplendent in his full-dress uniform, complete with his iconic ivory-handled pistols. The walk across the bridge was both ceremonial and deeply significant. Each step taken onto German soil symbolized a tangible Allied victory. Engineers had toiled tirelessly around the clock to erect the bridge, a testament to their remarkable improvisational engineering skills. The structure swayed slightly with each stride, securely anchored by massive cables. As they reached the eastern bank, the soil of Germany, Churchill paused and turned to face Patton. According to Patton's aide, who was an eyewitness to this exchange, Churchill stated, "General Patton, I have had the occasion to cross many rivers throughout my life. I crossed the Nile as a young officer, the Marne during the Great War, but this Rhine, Hitler's Rhine, to set foot on German soil with the enemy in disarray and retreat. This is a moment that will forever be etched in my memory, long after all other recollections have faded." Patton, typically known for his brash pronouncements, was momentarily rendered speechless. After a brief pause, he replied, "Prime Minister, this river was intended to halt our advance. Hitler declared it an impossibility, but the Third Army conquered it in a single night, with nothing more than canvas boats and determined men. That is precisely what transpires when you inform Americans that something cannot be accomplished." Churchill offered a genuine warm smile, which was subsequently captured in numerous photographs. "You are entirely correct, General," he responded. "Never inform an American that something is impossible. They tend to interpret such statements as a personal challenge. This exchange clearly revealed a profound mutual respect between two exceptionally distinct leaders. Churchill, the seasoned statesman of the Victorian era, who had personally witnessed the horrors of trench warfare, and Patton, the aggressive cavalryman who placed immense faith in speed and shock tactics. They hailed from different eras and employed contrasting styles, yet both possessed the heart of a warrior. The most revealing commentary emerged later, when Churchill was in private conversation with his military secretary. According to post-war memoirs, Churchill reflected, "That man Patton is utterly insufferable, arrogant, and disobedient, but my God, he is a formidable fighter." When history chronicles these events, it will be remembered that Hitler's formidable barrier ultimately succumbed not to massive bombardments, but to a general who simply decided the opportune moment had arrived to cross and proceeded to do so without hesitation. There is a valuable lesson within that narrative for all of us who may have grown overly cautious in our own pursuits. The contrast between the two crossings could hardly have been more stark. Montgomery's Operation Plunder involved an estimated 80,000 troops, supported by 1,000 artillery pieces. It stood as a masterpiece of meticulous planning, resulting in remarkably few casualties. By any objective standard, it was a textbook success. Patton's crossing, conversely, involved 4,000 troops within the initial 12 hours, supported by whatever artillery could be rapidly transported forward. Its success was attributed to speed, surprise, and the astute exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Initial casualties numbered fewer than 50 men, an astonishingly low figure. Both approaches proved effective, and both achieved their respective objectives. However, they represented fundamentally divergent philosophies of warfare. The German reaction provided a clear indication of which crossing they perceived as the greater threat. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of staff, was interrogated following the war. His testimony is preserved in army archives. He stated, "When Montgomery crossed, we were prepared. We had anticipated it. When Patton crossed at Oppenheim, it was a complete shock. We had minimal forces deployed there because we never believed anyone would attempt a significant crossing without extensive preparation. By the time we fully grasped the situation, it was already too late." Hitler's own reaction, as recorded by his personal secretary, was one of apoplectic rage. The Führer was beside himself with fury. He demanded to know how Patton had managed such a rapid crossing. He repeatedly exclaimed that a single American general, using simple canvas boats, had achieved what was supposedly impossible without weeks of preparation. Hitler had become fixated on Patton, referring to him as a demon who did not fight like a conventional soldier. The strategic ramifications were immediate. Patton's bridgehead expanded with astonishing speed. Within 48 hours, 2 full divisions had been successfully transferred across the Rhine. Within a week, he was spearheading an advance towards Frankfurt. Montgomery's forces, executing their crossing along a broader front, eventually linked up with Patton's army by March 28th, initiating an unstoppable Allied surge into the heart of Germany. However, beyond the tactical implications, Patton's Rhine crossing symbolized something more profound: a vindication of aggressive mobile warfare in an era increasingly dominated by overwhelming firepower. The official history of the U.S. Army concluded, "Patton's assault crossing stands as one of the most exemplary instances of opportunistic warfare in modern military history." The human dimension of this event is equally remarkable. Sergeant Warren M. reflected years later, "People ask me what I was thinking during the crossing. Honestly, my thoughts were simple. Don't let the boat tip over. Don't fall into the water. Keep paddling." These were not thoughts of grand heroism, but rather of immediate survival. Yet looking back, he recognized, we broke through Hitler's last line of defense. Private Donald Jones added, I told my grandson that I was terrified. He asked me why I did it. I explained, because my lieutenant got into the boat first, because the man next to me was paddling, because quitting simply wasn't an option. These were not grand strategic considerations, but rather a deep-seated reluctance to let down the comrades fighting alongside them. These testimonies illuminate the true essence of courage. It is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. The soldiers who braved the Rhine that night were not contemplating historical significance or strategic doctrines. Their immediate concern was to survive the next 11 minutes and to avoid failing their friends. Churchill's fascination with Patton's capabilities persisted. On March 30th, he wrote to President Roosevelt stating, "The American Army, under General Patton's command, has performed magnificently. While Field Marshal Montgomery's systematic approach serves crucial strategic purposes, I must acknowledge that Patton's exceptional exploitation of enemy weaknesses has demonstrably shortened the duration of this war. The Germans harbor a greater fear of him than of any other Allied commander." This admission was highly significant. Churchill, a staunch advocate for British military commanders, was openly acknowledging American military excellence, specifically highlighting a general whose operational style stood in stark contrast to established British military tradition. In private discussions, Churchill was even more effusive in his praise. His secretary recorded his sentiments. Patton exemplifies what we would term a thruster, a commander who initiates an attack because his instincts tell him the moment is precisely right. We have become excessively scientific in our approach to warfare, too reliant on perfect intelligence. Patton serves as a vital reminder that speed and decisive shock tactics remain critically important. When Patton tragically passed away in December 1945, following a motor vehicle accident, Churchill dispatched a heartfelt message to his widow. He wrote, "Your husband was a warrior in the truest sense of the word. His crossing of the Rhine will be a subject of study and remembrance as long as the art of warfare is examined. Britain has indeed lost a great friend." So what is the ultimate meaning of this pivotal moment? The Rhine crossing transcended a mere tactical victory. It served as a powerful validation of a particular style of warfare that had been questioned by many modern military theorists. In an era characterized by massive artillery bombardments and painstakingly coordinated operations, Patton unequivocally demonstrated that speed, surprise, and decisive initiative could still yield profound strategic advantages. The U.S. Army War College's analysis in 1948 concluded, Patton's Rhine crossing exemplified that opportunistic warfare, when executed by proficient forces under dynamic leadership, can achieve strategic outcomes that extend beyond conventional methodologies. It should be studied not as a substitute for planning, but rather as a complementary approach, a potent reminder that flexibility must be an integral component of even the most meticulously crafted plans. The British historian B.H. Little-Hart, writing in 1950, observed, "Since the era of Napoleon, theorists have engaged in ongoing debate regarding the merits of methodical versus opportunistic warfare. Patton's Rhine crossing provided compelling evidence that both approaches possess distinct advantages and inherent value. Neither methodology can be universally declared superior. Success ultimately hinges upon the judicious alignment of the chosen method with the specific circumstances of the situation." Churchill instinctively grasped this fundamental principle. His effusive praise was not merely a diplomatic courtesy. It was a recognition that warfare possesses a crucial psychological dimension. one that is as vital as its physical components. By executing such a swift crossing, Patton not only convinced the German High Command that sustained resistance was futile, but also instilled in the Allied soldiers an unwavering belief in the inevitability of victory. These convictions, in turn, became self-fulfilling prophecies. The final judgment on this remarkable feat comes from an unexpected source: Field Marshal Montgomery himself. In a conversation with a military historian in 1947, Montgomery candidly admitted that Patton's Rhine crossing was a stroke of genius. He stated, "I would never have dared to attempt such an operation. It was far too risky, relying too heavily on sheer luck. However, it succeeded brilliantly. That, fundamentally, is the difference between us. I never willingly took unnecessary risks." Patton viewed no peril as excessive if it held the promise of triumph. History will ultimately render judgment on which perspective proved more prudent, but I will concede this much. On the 22nd of March, 1945, Patton's chosen course of action was precisely what the prevailing circumstances dictated. This might very well represent the most forthright evaluation. Patton was not invariably correct. His tendency toward impulsivity often created difficulties throughout his military tenure. Yet at the Rhine in March of 1945, confronting a faltering adversary and a rapidly diminishing window of opportunity, his inherent inclination for bold offensive maneuvers was precisely the element the juncture demanded. This understanding emerged even as it starkly illuminated the divergence from Britain's strategic outlook. Exhausted by 6 protracted years of conflict, Britain had adopted a more circumspect stance, prioritizing the reduction of casualties and the conservation of its remaining capabilities. Conversely, America, having joined the fray more recently and possessing abundant resources, continued to champion audacious initiatives and the pursuit of definitive victory. Winston Churchill, bridging these distinct viewpoints, a man of Victorian fortitude who had personally witnessed the profound devastation wrought by modern warfare, grasped the validity of both methodologies. His commendation of Patton was entirely sincere, though it carried an undercurrent of wistful sentiment. In Patton's crossing of the Rhine, he perceived not merely a military triumph, but a symbolic passing of the baton. In his war memoirs, published in 1953, Churchill dedicated considerable space to detailing Patton's crossing of the Rhine. Among the many extraordinary accomplishments I had the privilege of witnessing during the Second World War, few left a more profound impression upon me than General Patton's audacious assault crossing. With minimal preliminary arrangements and an abundance of daring, he accomplished what conventional military doctrine deemed unachievable. Ultimately, the significance of Churchill's words, when Patton successfully navigated the Rhine, was eclipsed by his silences. He did not seek personal acclaim. He did not diminish the magnitude of the accomplishment. He did not permit nationalistic pride to overshadow the stark realities of military strategy. Instead, he unequivocally recognized merit wherever it was found, even when it originated from an ally whose operational methods diverged from his own. This magnanimity of spirit, this capacity to laud adversaries and acknowledge excellence irrespective of its origin, constituted perhaps Churchill's most formidable asset. It was the bedrock upon which the Allied coalition endured. It facilitated the seamless cooperation between British and American forces, despite their differing strategic approaches. And it is precisely why, when Patton achieved his crossing of the Rhine, Churchill's reaction was not one of envy or dismissal, but of unfeigned admiration. If you have persisted this far, you are undoubtedly a dedicated student of history. Please consider subscribing and activating the notification bell to ensure you never miss these in-depth analyses. Share this content with anyone who harbors a passion for untold military narratives. And remember, when Patton was informed that the Rhine presented an impassable obstacle, he offered no protestations. He simply proceeded to demonstrate its traversability.